We are delighted to welcome to the Jordan Center today Professor James Andrews, a professor of modern Russian history at Iowa State. He'll be speaking to us today about his new book project on the Moscow Metro. I was just telling him that I'm especially excited to hear what he has to say because this was the subject of my senior thesis as an undergraduate. So we're delighted to welcome you, and as we discussed, 15 minutes or so for a talk, and then we'll turn it over for questions. Thank you all for coming.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. I guess I'll sit, but although I'm a little peripatetic, so I'll probably get up and start lecturing too. What I prepared today is about a 15-20 minute intro, background, talking to you a little bit about how I came to the project, and I want to show you some visuals up to the 1930s, but the bulk of the talk is about visual narrative from the late 1930s up to the present, and I'll get to that in a moment. But one thing I wanted to mention, I'm a historian of science and technology, and I originally had written about the 1920s and 30s in a number of books, but more recently I worked on two projects over the last decade on the cultural history of Russian Soviet spaceflight. And the reason I mention that is that this is what drew me to the politics and the culture of what I call iconic large-scale technologies. And of course it led me to a long-term study of the Moscow Metro as a kind of, I would describe it as a type of prism to understand mobility, public space, iconography, mass transportation, and socialist systems. And of course there's a connection. I've been living probably over the last decade in a type of Khrushchevian world, because Khrushchev spent so much time supporting space flight and rocketry, and of course he managed in the 1930s the Metro project as well. So there's that connection. And just as some background, originally I saw this as an analysis of a Stalin-era showcase project, but I've decided to expand it, and I've broken this book into three parts, 1902 to 31, 32 to 53 when it was actually built, the main part of it, and then 1953 to the present, the post-Stalinist aspect of the project. And I've been looking at political administrative elements, engineering, labor, even archaeological aspects, because they dug so deep and unearthed so many things. I'm finding that that's been really interesting as well. Besides the most what I call palpable architectural and artistic elements of the project, which I'm going to mostly talk about today. And I've worked in numerous local, Moscow, Russian State Communist Party archives, as well as a host of museums. My evidential archival material has varied from written documents to a host of architectural plans, drawings, numerous original photographic archives, which I'm going to show you today, original black and white photos. And I even have thought of a spin-off project, a kind of more popular photographic history of Moscow in black and white, because I've been working with a lot of original negatives in the Museum of the History of Moscow, the former Moscow Party Photographic Archive, and a variety of other archives like that. So what I'd like to do, and I think I have a clock here, right, Heather, that I could set, is give you maybe 15-20 minute background on the period of the Moscow Metro that's usually not covered, that is the period 1902 to 31-32, and run you through some of the original photographs of when the party, that is the Bolshevik Party, started to announce the Metro project. And then the bulk of today's talk will focus, as I mentioned, on narrative and iconography. In any case, some of you may know this, but the first plan to build a Moscow subway was actually proposed to the Moscow City Council, or Duma, in the summer of 1902. So very early, and it was proposed by two engineers. Their names were Peter Belinsky and Evgeny Muir, and the proposal was rejected by the Duma Council because of the excessive cost of the project and the potential dislocation it would cause in the city center during construction. And what they meant by, what the Duma meant by dislocation is, originally they were going to do what was called the German method of what's called open trench digging. And you can imagine how disruptive that would be, particularly with a city like Moscow. Actually, these two engineers even conceived of a ring line because an original ring road that had horse-drawn carriages in Moscow was part of the 19th century pre-revolutionary part of the city as well. There were also a lot of tensions, actually. There were, if you look at even the newspaper editorials, there was an editorial in 1902 around this time in the newspaper Russian Word, or Ruskaya Slovo, that rejected the idea, and I quote, as an abruptly conceived project and a staggeringly impudent encroachment on everything Russian people hold dear in the city of Moscow. And it's humorous, but what's interesting to me is if you look at this as a pan-European phenomenon, this is not unusual to just Moscow alone. When they were thinking of building the Paris metro, there was actually a huge conservative movement against building that metro as well. There was even an organization that was set up in the 1880s that addressed this. And so you see this in other cities throughout Europe. But there were complex debates prior to World War I that arose again in 1912. But again, a variety of proposals were dismissed by the Moscow Duma's executive board, particularly as beyond its means financially. They even started to try to negotiate with private companies just before World War I, 1913 to 14, but none of that came to fruition. And I've been interested in the pre-revolutionary developments here, and I've worked in the Moscow City Archive. It's broken in half, actually, pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary. And what I found is the city, put the project off, that is the city executive, and they turned more to what I would describe as more imminent fee-generating enterprises, such as trams and tram railways, because what they estimated prior to World War I the project would be in pre-World War I terms, something like 1.5 million rubles to just start the project alone. So it was exorbitant. They had not at the time thought of deep shaft, as I'll tell you, tunneling, so there was a lot of tension regarding this project. But probably now I'm going to fast forward, what jump-started, in my opinion, and this is condensing it right for the sake of today's lecture, is certainly the influx of people coming in the 1920s and 30s into Moscow put a lot of pressure on Moscow party authorities, and particularly the Central Committee started to think about this more. And if you, without me going over the details, and I've looked at a lot of census data, Moscow's a rather interesting city if you think of it demographically. Between 1915 and 1920, right, there was, in 1915, in the first year of the war, Moscow had 1.8 million people. By 1920, it went down to 1.1 million, or actually 1,028,000. I mean, what happened obviously was during the revolution, but then Civil War, there was a lot of out-migration. But the city, in 5 years, lost almost, 800,000 inhabitants. Okay, but now fast forward, right, for the sake of trying to move in a timely fashion, the city in the 20th century probably experienced the most growth between 1920 and 1936. If you look at the census data towards the end of the Civil War, 1,028,000 inhabitants in 1920, 1936, 3.6 million, exactly 3,641,000. So in about, a 16-year period, approximately 300% growth. I mean, obviously this is tied, for those in the audience, I know there's many of them that study modern Russian history as experts, right? It's tied to Stalin's hyper-industrialization programs, collectivization of the farmland. The city was literally flooded with new arrivals and migrants from rural areas. It was growing into what editorial newspapers and contemporaries called a peasant metropolis. And because of that, obviously, there was a lot of pressure, right, for transportation and accommodations. So two prominent young communist figures, Nikita Khrushchev and Lazar Kaganovich, were entrusted with organizing the building of the first Russian metro that I would argue would have two purposes. I mean, one, because we've just been talking about that, or I have, one is the practical, the one of moving the new urban masses underground, since the streets above were so overcrowded. But then there's the symbolic, which I'll talk about today, the gesture of a metro that would serve as a visual architectural showcase for socialism, a type of technological museum for the achievements of workers, peasants, and the Soviet state. Khrushchev, therefore, right, as some background, was intimately involved in the project. He gave a lot of his time to it. Just a quote from his memoirs, and there's been some recent Russian memoirs where he turned a lot of his time to working on the project. Kaganovich actually turned a lot of the project over to the daily parts of the project over to Khrushchev to manage. And I quote, "I gave 80% of my time in the 30s to the metro. I went to and from the Moscow committee department through the shafts of the metro. In the morning, I climbed down a shaft near where I lived, and I came out of a shaft near party office buildings. It would be hard for me to describe how strenuous a workday we put in. We slept as little as possible so that we could give all our time, quote unquote, in Khrushchevian fashion," he said, "to the cause." But he was really, obviously, his work was inextricably linked with developing the infrastructure of the city. And there was a lot of pressure, not just on Khrushchev, Kaganovich, but a lot of, as well, lower level management during this time. And you can find this, I've worked quite extensively in the former Moscow Party archive, and you see a lot of pressure on local bureaucrats to move the project along during this period of the 1930s. What's also interesting about the project is the way it was being announced constantly to some extent. It was sort of the big project that was coming. And if you take a look at some of these slides, and I'm going to look back, these are original photographs. Some of them are from the Museum of the City of Moscow archive. The others that you'll see in a second are from, as I said, the Moscow Communist Party photographic archive, which has its own archive separate from the document archive in the city of Moscow. And you could see that starting in 1932, there were a number of billboards all over the city, like this one behind me. This was from May Day 1932. It was displayed at Hotnik Riad, and it's the plan of the metro coming. Once the metro was opened 3 years later, this also is an original of Stalin to your left, Molotov to his right, celebrating the opening of the metro at Dom Soyuz in May of 1935. And you could see here, although Molotov's head cuts it off, right? Ni taki krepesti, которые bolsheviki. There are no fortresses which the Bolsheviks cannot overcome during this time. And it was certainly one of the big showcase projects of the time. As it began, right, they started taking photographs of various metro pavilions outside. This is the Kirovskaya metro station, which was opened in May of 1935, and as many of you know, in 1990, its name was changed to Chistaya Prudi. And this is where in World War II, the branch of the General Staff was stationed there during the war. And in 1947, if you're interested, this is the first Moscow metro station that had luminescent lamps inside in the late 40s as well. And as a number of these very famous stations opened, photographers from Pravda were sent out to actually photograph them, and then you saw them on the front pages of Pravda as well. If I could just get up for a second here, and I think I've got this slide changer here. This is the very famous, Lenin Library, and the project was begun in 1930. And to your left here is the old 18th century Pashkov house, and that was an original aristocratic home that then became the Russian State Library in the 19th century. And then the metro station opened in May of 1935. Also a rather modernistic station for its time, at least. As time went on, there was a lot of voluntary brigades on the project. A number of women shock workers, as you can see here, Metrostroy workers celebrating 1917, November of 1935, 18 years after the revolution. Workers were brought in, and they were generally housed in the northern part of the city, and they were given temporary kapiski, or temporary passes to live. But for the most part, from what I could tell, unlike other projects that some of my colleagues like Lauren Graham have documented, say the Bielamore Canal in the north, for the most part the labor was not, for the most part, prison labor, but more voluntary shock troop and other forms as well over time. And of course, as every station was opened between 1935 and 1937, there were always dignitaries there, typical banners, placards of Lenin and Stalin at the various stations as time went on. And in many respects, what's interesting also about the project is it was a great engineering feat in these first couple years, particularly 1935 to 1938. And originally, they decided that they were going to try a method they called the German method of digging open trench method on the surface, but instead, and this was actually the plan that the leader of the metro, a guy by the name of Reuter, had supported, and they were originally just going to have elevators, but his assistant, an engineer, one of the chief engineers on the project, a guy by the name of Mayakovsky, not Mayakovsky, and I'll show you his station in a second, but this young engineer was very influenced by a number of British advisors and engineers who had been working in Moscow at the time, and he had traveled, Mayakovsky, to London, and he saw the way the Piccadilly Circus, for any of you who've been in London, right, that deep station was built, and it was called deep shaft tunneling. And what's interesting, if I could just make an aside here, and I've been looking at archival letters between Khrushchev and Stalin, and the tensions between the chief director, Reuter, and his engineering assistant, Mayakovsky, and obviously they were at odds with one another. Originally, they were going to go with what was the cheaper, right, model, but Stalin overturned Reuter and said, no, let's invest, right, in a much more, what he called expensive program. But what was advantageous about it, they could be bomb shelters, they could later, right, house the heads of the army staff, etc. And this is what the young chief engineer Mayakovsky had said to Khrushchev to get Khrushchev to talk to Stalin about moving in that direction. And I quote, "Comrade Khrushchev, we're building the metro originally according to the so-called German or open trench method. This method is very unsuitable for the city of Moscow. I propose that we switch to the English, or what's called the closed tunnel method. We will have to build the metro deeper. It would be a little more expensive, but if you keep in mind the possibility of war, you'll see that the tunnels with their reinforced shielding and buttress walls would make excellent bomb shelters." So they were conceiving of this, obviously, ahead of time, or at least this young engineer was, which I found interesting when I looked at these letters. There's another advantage, he said, to Comrade Khrushchev, to the English method. And again, I quote from Mayakovsky. He said, "We could tunnel right under buildings." He said, "This is what's important. Then there's also the matter of how we're going to get passengers down into these deep stations." He said, "Look, the director, Reuter, wanted to have elevators, but why not use escalators?" And so what they did was, with British advisors, at least up until an early part of the program, they started doing deep shaft tunneling, and with, believe it or not, the German Siemens company, Siemens, they actually used early forms of escalators at the time to transport people up and down from the stations. I mean, the British advisors on the project helped tremendously, from what I could tell looking through records, particularly with rolling stock engineering designs. The escalators came from German companies. The British helped, I think, with deep shaft construction, but all of this, many of you probably know, ended in 1933-34 as the NKVD arrested British engineers for quote-unquote purported espionage, and they accused them technically of having too much intimate knowledge of the physical layout of the city and the infrastructure. And this was called the Metropolitan Vickers affair, electrical company affair. And their engineers were deported, and it ended the British consultative work on the metro and other Moscow City infrastructure projects after 1934. After that time, all labor and artwork, particularly, actually earlier than that, all of the architectural work was from Soviet laborers, artists, and architects working together. So I hope that gives you a little background in what, 15, 20 minutes, right, of how they got to the late 1930s. And so what I want to focus on today is one aspect of this book project, which I'm calling Iconic Metropolitan, Mass Culture, Architectural Visions, and the Politics of Public Space in Modern Russia from 1902 to the present. What I want to talk about today mostly is looking at visual culture, getting some sense of narrative and how we could think about the project in narrative terms. I want to talk to you about some of the very important architects and artists that were paired and worked on the project well through the Second World War and afterwards. I see sort of, without being sort of reductive, sort of four major periods from the late 1930s to the present, and what I would call sort of visual paradigms. The first, which I'll talk to you about, the late 1930s through maybe the Second World War. That first period I would call sort of early modernist stations and revolutionary thematics. The second, from the later part of the war through the post-war era up through 53, I would call this a kind of Baroque, late Stalinism, where you see sort of this greater Russian national thematics. Then there was a period of what I call the period of nothingness, and I'll explain why I think that still has a narrative. This is the Khrushchev, Brezhnev period, or I call the period of vacuous utility. And then perestroika from 1985, when thematics returned once again in the late 80s. That is the themes of stations up to the present. And so what I'd like to do is maybe begin just talking a little bit about some theoretical ways that I've looked at understanding narrative in Russian terms. And then from there, together, maybe you could imagine the metro if for some reason, catastrophically, everything was annihilated on the surface. I want to take you on a journey imagining the metro as kind of preserving these archaeological layers, the evolution of the city, its inhabitants, the emblems of sort of epochs as we move together from the late 1930s to the present in the next about 30 minutes or so. So one of the things that I've been interested in as a cultural historian of technology and with this project theoretically is I've been thinking a lot about a variety of theorists, like the French theorist Pierre Janet, J-A-N-E-T, and he wrote in the interwar period. And he thought of city dwellers as creating a diverse sense of humanity and mass mobility through narration. And that as they move through the city, they narrate their life. And another French ethnologist who many of you have heard of, Michel Dissertot, who also has thought of city life and is a French cultural historian, he seems to think that cities could also be contextualized in narrative forms. And he argued, for instance, that in Athens, for instance, the vehicles of mass transportation in modern Greece are literally called metaphori, and that the masses, so to speak, go and come from work using public transport. So what I want you to think about is in Dissertoian language or in Janet language, maybe we could think about the Moscow Metro as creating what I would call spatial trajectories. I've also thought a lot about the perspective of the cultural theorist W.J.T. Mitchell. And Mitchell has thought a lot about these iconographic artistic spaces, which obviously the metro is one of them. So I'd like to suggest that the image is evolving over time that I'll show you today very quickly in the Metro's architecture develops a type of what I would call specific iconology. And they rhetorically speak in public to different generations at different times by persuading or telling different stories. In a way, this is very similar to the notion that Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian philologist and cultural theorist, formulated when he thought of a chronotope, a notion that argues for a conception of space, architectural space, public space, as historically contextually specific. I mean, the word coming from the Greek literally means time and space moving together, and Bakhtin insisted on the historical nature of these kinds of concepts. So with that said, I'd like to begin looking at some of the early stations, as you can see here. Right? And this is the Kievskaya station by the architect Chechulin, and it was built in 1938. I think that some of this, if in this first of 4 phases, these architects, I think, had a kind of modernist orientation, but eventually they would start struggling within the parameters of socialist realism. The Kievsky station is rather interesting because Chechulin was eventually the chief architect of Moscow. Some of you may know that he held that position after the war between 1945 and 1949. He's a very influential architect. He's the one in 1958 that designed the outdoor swimming pool, which was on the site of the Palace of Soviets that was never built, right? Where the church now of the Savior was rebuilt. And for those of my generation that were in college in the late Brezhnev era, I swam in the pool and remember it, right, fondly or not. But certainly Chechulin is a very interesting architect. But alongside of Chechulin's modernist Kievsky station are the beautiful stations by Alexei Dushkin, who I think is one of the most influential of the Metro architects. For instance, the station named after the futurist poet Mayakovsky was designed by Dushkin in 1938, and he won the grand prize at the New York World's Fair for his design. Spacious futuristic halls are adorned with stainless steel columns, colored marble. It's clearly my favorite, and many others. And what's interesting to me, and I know this is a rather anecdotal issue, but it's very important. It was in the fall of 1938 that the city of Moscow and also the state started pairing architects that they chose to do stations with artists. That is, chief artists were paired with architects. So Dushkin was paired with the artist who did mosaics, Alexander Deneka, and he did a number of the ceiling mosaics that I'm sorry I don't have on the slides here, but that you could see there in the cupolas as well. And it was Dushkin that also did Revolutionary Square in 1938, and he was paired here with the sculptor Matvei Manazir. And here you see figures that is in the halls, right? These figures are busts of Red Guards, workers, sailors, young communists, pioneer heroes, heroines to the Soviet era. They seem to me to cast a particular historical narrative for the passenger, literally walking you in linear progression through the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, its socialist constituencies during 1917. They focused on everyday heroes and heroines. They made the revolution possible, almost portraying them in a kind of Promethean type of vision, particularly with the sculpted busts that Dushkin had Matvei Manazir do during this time. You know, Dushkin also, as an aside, is a very, very interesting architect because he also did 5 other subways between the period 1935 through the war in 1943. Besides the 2 that I just mentioned, he did Ploshchad Revolucji, he did Avtozavodskaya, he did Novoslobodskaya, so he worked with a number of artists. He was he's got a very interesting life. I would love to write, a side project on Dushkin, and I've looked through his letters. There's a Khrushchev architectural archive just near the Lenin Library, and you could find a number of these architects, their letters and various on various projects that they worked on. But what I find interesting about him, if you may, or if I may, to go off just on a slight tangent, is he originally worked in the Donbass, and he was involved in zoning plans for Donbass towns, and he may have been tapped by the young Kaganovich and Khrushchev because they worked in the Ukrainian Communist Party. Particularly Kaganovich headed the Ukrainian branch of the CP, and they brought him to Moscow, that is Dushkin, in the 30s. And what's also to me interesting, he has a very interesting biography. He was associated with the left-wing architectural group Vopra, later Ivan Fomin, who's another Metro architect, worked with him. And if you look at some of his letters, something that was interesting to him, if we go back to, this is an original, also from an archival photo. And if I could just get out of the way for a second. Dushkin was very, very interested in his letters. He talked a lot about light, right? He was very interested in lighting these stations, and as you could see when he worked with Danica, not just on the cupolas, but they were very interested in large, right, vaulted ceilings, and also casting a large sort of light down onto the platform. And he had read, he's an interesting man, he had read a lot about the psychology of fear, and he argued that passengers, especially in the 1930s, were going to be afraid to go down into the depths, right, of the subway, and that one way to help them overcome this, he argued, was to create these vaulted ceilings that were lit, that felt open, so that when people were waiting for the passenger trains, they would not feel so confined. And it's rather interesting to think about this sort of psychology, because I've read a lot, as a historian of science and technology, I've been interested in sort of new technologies, that is the 1920s, 30s, and you see this globally. There's always, and it's not that these people were Luddites in any way, shape, or form, but there is a fear, right, of change, but particularly a fear of the use of certain kinds of technologies, and especially ones that were rather cavernous, like the Moscow metro. So if I could proceed forward to this sort of second stage that I want to talk about, and that is sort of what I would call a Baroque, late Stalinist stage. The metro, as many of you know, was still being built during the war, and to me this is rather remarkable. And not only was it being built, but there were hospitals down there, clinics, they had film nights, there were schools, high schools, sometimes had classes there. I've interviewed a number of Muscovites, some of which, unfortunately, recently, who are in their early 90s, have been rather sick, so it's hard to interview people from the 30s, right? There's not as many people left of that generation. But they talk about going down there quite often during the war, during this time. And what's interesting to me, too, a number of people were actually born in the metro. And, as another aside, I was working in the Shushev architectural archive, and one of the architectural archivists looked to me about in his early 70s, and this was, maybe 213, 214, or actually no, 212 when I was working there. And after working with this archivist for over a week or so, he finally turned to me and he said, James, I have a confession. Я тоже родился в метро. Stancy Baumskaya. And he said this happened quite often. And then he started to show me, and I'm sorry I don't have them with me, photographs of makeshift clinics that were set up. And so, this project, which seems to grow like the blob at every moment, I thought of an offshoot on the war and citizens of Moscow living underground. Sort of the underground cultural element to me is fascinating because of how this continued. I mean, we think of probably the more sort of public speeches that are, documented. Stalin gave a number of speeches down in the metro during the war, but the social, cultural element is equally as fascinating, sort of everyday citizens who lived during this period. So in terms of what I would call a second period, right, it sort of the late period of the war up through the late 50s, up to Stalin's death, you see a number of new stations opened. The one you see here, again, this is an original. This was the Stalinskaya station, which opened in 1944, and in October of 1961, during the second phase of de-Stalinization, Khrushchev had the name changed to the Simanovskaya, and this also is a rather fascinating process. You can see here in this original, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, right, the Stalinskaya station there, its name, adjectival ending, and then the bas-relief of Stalin. All of this was erased in the period about 1956 to 61. There were actually a number of busts of Stalin throughout the metro, all throughout a variety of stations, and these were removed during this time. Again, this process alone, it's something that I would call a type of process of erasure, which is something I like to call it. Is very interesting. That happened between 1956 and approximately 1961 during this time. And actually, the metro itself was named between 1935 and 1957 after Kaganovich, right? And the great irony there is Khrushchev managed most of the project, and he was a bit obviously annoyed and miffed by this. But in 1957, 4 years before Khrushchev started erasing Stalin from the metro, from bas-reliefs and everything, Kaganovich's name, because he was part of the anti-party group in 57, so his name was also being erased and was taken off the metro as well during that time. So Khrushchev, right, finally got what he had originally wanted between 57 and 61 as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that had gone on. But to get back to these kind of periods, right, in the war and the post-war era, the architectural changes, in my opinion, were rather dramatic. You see what I call more Baroque, ornate types of architecture. The architectural space is almost a reflection of what I would call a new trope, or what cultural historians would call a trope, a new chronotrope. You have these ornate, overdone spaces laden with heroes of the past. The construction was grander, it was more colossal, maybe the triumph of empire over the ethos of the older revolutionary emblems. This you see here is the second Komsomolskaya station. It was built in 1952 during this era, and it was built by the leading architect Alexei Shushev, who was also a very, very famous architect who worked on a number of metro projects. Shushev had been paired with the artist Pavel Korin, and I want to talk about both of them in a second, as I had been talking about how they were paired with a number of architects and artists over time. And Shushev is a rather, of all the three that I've talked about, Chechulin, Dushkin, and if you add Shushev, he's a very interesting architect as well, because he's one of the older ones. He's interesting because he studied under Leon Benoit and Ilya Repin, one of the Pedevizhniki, if you study art history. And he had originally studied at the Imperial Academy of Arts in Petersburg, 1891 to 1897. He was born in Bessarabia. He lived 1873 to 1949, so just after the war. He built a number of very, very important buildings, Narkomzem, the Ministeriate of Agriculture. He was involved in the collective effort of the Lenin Mausoleum as well. So a number of these metro architects really were involved in a lot of Moscow building projects. I find Khrushchev interesting too, because just like I went through the letters in a number of museums of Chichulin and through the letters of Dushkin, what I find interesting about Khrushchev is what his interests were, right? I mean, Dushkin may have been interested more in the 30s in modernist architectural forms, light, thinking about the way people are transported. Khrushchev was more interested in a kind of monumentalism, it almost seemed like. He fit in pretty well. He had been interested in neoclassical forms. You could see that, right? And in his letters, he said that he stylized some of them, particularly Komsomolskaya, after churches. He saw them as internal churches, he said, so to speak, built inside the ground. And he said that he stylized them after 17th century Muscovite churches. Why 17th century? I don't know, I struggle with that, but I find that really interesting when you look at his letters. He was paired, at least for Komsomolskaya, right? This Komsomolskaya station that many of you know, 1952, he was paired with a very influential and rather controversial and interesting artist by the name of Pavel Korin. And Korin is fascinating to me if we're talking about iconography, and it should be obvious, but he's personally fascinating because his father was a professional icon painter, right? And in 1912, he also went to the School of Painting in Moscow, Sculpture and Architecture, and then in the 20s and 30s and beyond, he was patronized by a lot of very influential people. And before Gorky, Maxim Gorky's death in 1934, Gorky was one of his patrons. And it's Korin who actually did the mosaics that you could see here in Komsomolskaya. And on your right is Dmitry Donskoy, 14th century Muscovite prince, Battle of Kulakova, beginning of the end of Mongol rule. And on the left, Alexander Nevsky, 13th century Kievan or Novgorodian prince. And this is very, very important because in many respects, Korin, in his iconography, was very interested in looking at some of these pre-revolutionary figures and how they were displayed during this time period. If you think about sort of what happened after this period, as I move forward rather quickly, I would argue that a third period developed in the early to late Khrushchev period into the Brezhnev period. You almost develop what I would call a type of architecture of nothingness. That is, the grandiose eloquence of the period of the 1940s and 50s came to an end, and it came abruptly to an end in November of 1955. And for anyone who's studied a little architectural history in Russia, you may know that in November of 1955, Nikita Khrushchev issued a very famous edict, and I'm translating. The edict in November of 55 was called on the liquidation of excesses in construction and architecture, and it's part of his de-Stalinization campaign, which certainly some architectural historians lamented as to what happened afterwards, because soon after this point, many Moscow metro stations started to be built not only in a more simple and less ornate fashion, but they were intentionally more narrow, and they weren't deep shaft stations. And really, as the city expanded during this time, and particularly as Khrushchev built a lot of prefabricated housing projects as well, so did the metro. And if you've thought a lot about sort of the connection between the two, during the Khrushchev era in Moscow, there was a great housing crisis.
And it was during the Khrushchev period that there were about 13,000 standardized prefabricated apartment blocks that were constructed under Khrushchev. I would argue you almost see a parallel development, late Khrushchev into Brezhnev, under the ground. And what I mean by that is you have what architectural historians call these prefabricated, you see it here in Akademicheskaya, which was built October of 1962. You see these what are called pillar Trispin designs, much cheaper, not deep, they're not deep shaft. And the Russian architects that built them called them caterpillar tunnels because they had 20 paired pillars. And I always tell this anecdote that I was standing on Akademicheskaya with a historian and biologist on my left and a historian of technology and architectural historian on my right. And the biologist reminded me that the French are wrong, that centipedes do not have 100 legs, they actually have, and the Russians are right, they have 20 pairs and therefore 40, and that this is why they call them caterpillar tunnels, because they're built in this prefabricated manner with 20 pairs, right, of these Trispin style pillars, as the architectural historian reminded me, and they did a number of these. What I also find interesting about this period is that, although I haven't done enough gender prosopography, although I would like to, as we move through so many periods, right, in this grand overview, but this is the first time you see female architects that become the lead architects on these stations. And this one was done by Yulia Kolesnikova, so this starts to become a little more prevalent in the period of the 60s and the 70s as well. So the Moscow, as the city of Moscow expanded into the outskirts, well, so did the metro. And human passengers weren't distracted by excess or decor anymore. As the German historian of late 20th century Moscow architecture and urban form, Karl Schlogel, put it so aptly, in a city where in any case the succession of historical eras has been accelerated and compressed, it seems natural to try to identify generational differences. And one could argue, therefore, that the narrative in this time was one of nondescript, everyday socialism as it was emerging and maturing in the late Khrushchev, Brezhnev era and beyond. So to conclude, and try and to be as timely as possible in the next 5-10 minutes, the last period comes from the period of perestroika, 1985 to the present, where you see thematics re-emerging once again. And you see sort of Russian national thematics, particularly individuals during the era of the Gorbachev period. Mendelevskaya in 1988 is named after the very famous chemist Dmitry Mendeleev in 88. And then you see this developing further in time as you go forward into the first part of the 21st century with Park Pobyedy Station, which was built in 2003. It's a very beautiful modernistic station. Again, I think one of my favorite. And a more recent one, Dostoevskaya Station, the one that's done in black and white with the gorgeous bas-reliefs and various novels that are described in various panels that you could see here. If I had to, as I'm ending, right, how do you describe sort of this last period? The cultural critic and Harvard semiotician Homi Bhabha has noted that when nations are revitalizing their national image, they tend to invoke narrative themes that are myopic and glorify, and they come up with a unified concept of the nation state to the exclusion of other types of social, cultural, or even ethnic subaltern narratives. Is this happening in Putin's Russia? I hesitate to say, but there is a little bit of that, right? You see this maybe with Park Victory. It glorifies both the Napoleonic 1812 war on one end and the Second World War on the other. And if you're interested, Park Pobjedy is one of the world's deepest subway stations in the entire world, 84 meters, 275 feet. Okay, so in that whirlwind tour from its original building through these various periods, if I could end, and if I could have just a couple minutes, let me say this. Today, the Moscow Metro has 8.9 million riders on a daily basis, more than the New York City and London metros combined. It has 200 stations approximately as it's growing. The Metro is still, interestingly enough, a state-run enterprise, and you still see these very beautiful modernistic stations being built. So the Metro has been an archetype socialist urban space, one with a politicized mission with its iconographic images, statues, frescoes that serve both as a functional transportation for individuals and had a politicized meta-meaning as a museum to the 1917 revolution. The Metro building was a technological feat because of its cavernous stations, its long passenger tunnels. Materials came from literally all over the former Soviet Union, such as marble that adorned its more ornate stations from the Urals and the Caucasus Mountains. As I've tried to argue today in my very brief overview, the plot, to some extent, and the narrative of these stations changed throughout the 20th century as new periods in Soviet and post-Soviet history invoked new themes at different generational junctures, particularly after 1955 and de-Stalinization. And the case study of the narrative of the Metro gives us, to some extent, a study of the building of socialism itself. The Bolsheviks would say, and there was that very famous adage, "Comrades, we are building a metro, therefore building socialism itself." I'd like to revise that slogan myself with a new narratological version of the old catchphrase, "Comrades, we are building a metro, therefore we're telling the story of socialism and beyond." Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll open the floor now to questions. Perhaps I'll start. Oh, no. Well, I was wondering if you would elaborate on the relationship you're positing. Well, there are multiple directions for this, but particularly this generational metaphor that you're using. Could you specify the relationship between the generations and metro design that you're trying to articulate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question that, some architectural historians like Schlegel, who wrote about Moscow and as it's changed. And I think Schlegel, and I think maybe myself, think of it in two ways. That is, people who were born at particular times, Muscovites, think of themselves, right, as citizens during a particular phase in the metro's building. And so they use that as part of their collective memory in a way. I wouldn't call it the memory of necessarily material culture, but their material surroundings. But I also think, and I think therefore that different generations, as you move into the post-World War II era, identify themselves with the expanding stations that have gone into the microraioni, and they think of the metro in sort of more dull terms to some extent almost, and they talk about it. That they don't think of the visuals of the metro, they think of it in a much more utilitarian way. And I find this interesting when I talk to different Russians, doing oral interviews, who lived and were born at different times. They somehow see their generation in those terms. That's one way to think about it, but then you could think about it more progressively over time. That is, the historical days, if that makes sense. Which is less personal, right? That is looking at the metro and as it changes as a reflection of how the city from above changed.
and then the politics of urban space as well. So that and I hope that wasn't too abstract, and I mean, I like to think about it in the personal terms that different generations of Muscovites have and how they relate to it on the one hand, and then the historians' long-term gaze as well. I mean, even on the contemporary level, from a sociological perspective, I find it interesting how contemporary Muscovites think about the metro in different ways. Some of them think about, the fact that sort of private transport and cars have changed the nature of the city, and some people don't even want to use the metro anymore, while others, see it as a very important part of their daily lives. And sometimes there's a class element to that too, I would think. I hope that answers your question.
Well, is this a story of design or usage?
I think it's, you mean my story or this story? I think it's a story of both. I mean, I see, as I started out, I mean, I see the metro as a very utilitarian sort of project. I think it's a project about mobility. I think that, because of the pressures in the city, and I also see it, I see it as a sort of a project in the history of design as well. And I think that they move together to some extent on some level.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk, and as you were talking about the narrative function, I thought in a way it's very interesting because the move towards an everyday socialism in some way can be seen as a failure of imagination, as a failure of putting forward a narrative, even though it is within a modernist framework. So there's nothing there to really grab onto, and I was wondering, I mean, perhaps this has something to do with the decreasing influence of socialism as, something that was really seen as a passionate sort of ideology. At the same time, when you move through the metro, all those very utilitarian subway stations very clearly mark that this is not the center, this is the periphery, right? And then when you go into the center, it's a very clearly marked periphery. So there may be a little bit of that going on. And then to kind of speak to your question about why the 17th century, if you look at the history of the Russian style in the 19th century, the 17th century became very much the model for Russian style. And this is centered on the Academy of Arts and Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, who was a long-term patron, president, etc. of the Academy. And what they did is they went out and they took pictures of all these 17th century churches. And that is where this idea of what a Russian style is, the wooden architecture that was used in international expositions, and all sorts of kind of, the creation of almost, like a souvenir idea of what Russia is. So going back to the 17th century, totally, for the Russian style here, it totally makes sense within that earlier figuring out of what counts as Russian.
It's interesting. I'm sorry, your name? It's Susan?
Susan Smith-Peter.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, two things. If I could connect what you sort of had two, well, one question, one comment, but if I could connect your question to going back to Anne's two questions again, I don't know if this will answer it, but if I could go back just quickly here to, and this is why I put these together. Okay, so there are some architectural historians, like, say, Catherine Cook and others who look at the history of Russian art, who try to revisit this period of what's called Stalinist Baroque, right? And see it as much more complicated than we would think. That is, it's a rather eclectic history and an eclectic process, right? Whereas they see this period, right, the period that both of you are talking about, as a period where Khrushchev, through his de-Stalinization, eliminated that eclectic, very, very creative period. So in a way, Cook is a revisionist, right? Because earlier work on the history of Stalinist architecture, sort of criticized Stalinist realism. Cook and others have written about, well, it's a very diverse style, right? It has a little Baroque Renaissance, a little 17th century church architecture, etc. and that this architecture is rather bland, right? And there's a nothingness to it. However, and I hope this connects the two, if you're a social historian, right, and you could see this as part of what you described and I described earlier, Susan, as a kind of everyday socialism when, in a sense, the metro really was becoming a people's metro. There were more people using it. It was much more connected, although peripheral, it was connected to where people were living.
Right.
And on that level, I think it becomes almost more utilitarian. Because what's interesting to me is if you the people that I've interviewed who grew up in the 30s and now many of them are dead, they would tell me that actually when the metro was open, even though there were so many crowds up above and the metro would help this, hopefully, that people weren't using the metro early on, that they were afraid to sometimes use it. It seemed almost empty at times, at least early on. And these are people, say, who were born in 1924 and they were maybe 10 years old, 12 years old, 35 to 37. And obviously there were these beautiful, ornate, sort of cavernous halls, but the question is originally how utilitarian. One could argue it was far more utilitarian later on, and it far more paralleled the growth of a radial city towards the outskirts, and this periphery that you're talking about, so to speak. So I find this period rather interesting from a number of perspectives, in terms of some of the things that you're talking about. But your comment about the 17th century is rather interesting to me too, because as I was talking about earlier, some of these architects were trained before or after the revolution, and like Khrushchev's a rather interesting example of that. I don't know if that connects those two questions and comments in ways, but anyways.
Yeah, Sanders, if you would introduce yourselves as you ask your question.
I'm Sam Casper. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. This is really fascinating. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the question of names of the metro stations and of the metro itself. You alluded to the fact that initially it was named after Kakanovich, and then they changed the name to in honor of Lenin. There's the change from Stalinskaya to Semyonovskaya. And then also you have the post-Soviet shift of a lot of stations' names from Sverdlov to Teatralnaya, Kirovskaya, Чистые пруды. And so I was wondering, A, how this sort of shifts the relationship between the outward presentation of the metro station itself and then the interior design. And then if we're thinking about this again in terms of sort of generations of use and experience, how this affects the terrain of people's experiences. You're literally changing sort of the identity of the city itself by changing the names of the metro. And so how these political developments are reflected in how people, how they experience and recall the metro.
I mean, again, all three of these are interconnected. And it's Sam?
Yes.
Yeah, your question is fascinating to me too, because obviously, as I was showing you up here, here's Stalinskaya Station, right, 44 during the war, and it's changed in 61. Well, in a way, I have a complicated answer to your complicated question, is that a lot of this involves memory, right? People, if you talk to who lived at different times, people who were born, say, in the early 20s or mid-20s, remember Stalin's bust in the metro, and they remember it named after Kaganovich, and it gets imprinted in them. And you think about psychological memory a lot when you're doing studies like this. Others who were born, say, after the Second World War, and say were in their teens during what I call phase 2 of de-Stalinization, think of erasure more, and they think of the process of the renaming as part of de-Stalinization. So there is a generational element too. They think less of the Stalinskaya station, in terms of its original name, and more in terms of its Khrushchevian name, so to speak. And so I think and I hope I'm answering your question, I think that, again, the generations conceive of a moment, right? And that moment's very, very significant. And I think, say, people who were born approximately in 1980, right, or end of the Brezhnev era, Soviets, and who continued to live in the former Soviet Union and then Russia after the Gorbachev era, also as teens, think of the metro in terms of the new changing names, Chistya Prudi and all of those, as part of a moment of changes in what is the post-communist era and the political administrative development that comes with that. To me, that's fascinating. I wish I could do, and I haven't been able to, and the generation of the 30s now is lost, sadly, in the 40s. I tried when I first started this project. I wish I could have done more generational oral histories, because for me, that's where this level of memory and the way that people think of themselves in different political sort of turns, moments of catalytic moments, I think are how Soviets at least identified with that particular change. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very interesting question, and I've thought about it when talking to individuals particularly. I'm sorry.
Thanks. I'm Maya Vinokur. I'm an adjunct instructor here, and I wanted to ask a question based on this thing that you mentioned about the liquidation of excesses edict.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the more ornate and sort of like in-your-face style of the first two phases that you were talking about also coincides with relatively less efficiency and more waste or greater use of resources, and slash manpower or woman power, I guess, versus the later more utilitarian phases. Like, is the turn to utilitarianism accompanied by greater efficiency and less usage of resources, or not? And if so, why?
It's excellent question, because it's basically a socioeconomic aspect, right, of the project. Absolutely. The earlier stations were more costly. They took a lot more time. The artists employed spent a lot of time on mosaics, painting, etc. They're obviously now the most costly to the city of Moscow, which fascinates me, to repair, and they need repair. Whereas what are called prefabricated, what architects call pillar trispid designs, were prefabricated literally. That is, the posts right here, much like Khrushchev's 5-story apartments, were prefabricated in particular factories. Instead of using marble, they were using cheap tile. Again, I just keep speaking of generations. I'm talking about my generation, those that were students, say, in the late Brezhnev era. My recollections myself, actually, to link your two, never mind Soviets, was when I was on early exchanges in the early 1980s, of sitting or standing in these stations and literally watching tiles fall off, and they were usually replaced with a different shade of beige, and they were cheaply done. Yet, at the same time, they were being built rapidly, and they were extending the city, way beyond, its limits. I mean, if you think, I'm sorry, I forgot your first name again.
Maya.
Maya. I even think about this in terms of population. Moscow just exploded, obviously, in the post-World War II era. So you needed to have the more efficient building of stations. I almost see today, right, when this process has slowed down, although they're building, a second ring, they're thinking about, building all these beautiful new stations, and they're rather costly. They're almost going back to that phase 2 in a way, not just in terms of the narrative of grandeur, but the cost. So, for instance, again, Pobyedy or Dostoevsky, or Dostoevskaya, excuse me, are far more costly. Although, my God, if you look at population demographics in Moscow, even in the last 4 years, the city in 2012 was 11.5 million. Now in 2016, it's 13.5 million. It's the largest city in Europe, and it's on the UN's list of the top 20 population cities in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's an influx of temporary workers coming into the city. So today, you almost need to have parallels operating. Stations being built quickly to get ornately too. It's odd, but that's jumping ahead. I hope I answered your question about the specifics of the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period.
Yeah, if I could just ask a brief follow-up, can you connect just like these socioeconomic aspects with the narrative elements that you're trying to explore? Like, is there a way that the costlier stations have a different, I guess, like memory function even in the present day? Do you think that the more ornate stations that are being built now are like intentionally harkening back to like late Stalinism?
I don't, it's hard to say, right? I don't think intentionally, although I think there's a level of grandeur being brought back, and again, Pobyedy is probably the most clear example of that, glorifying 1812 and 1945, especially underneath, the park that's above it. Whether that's true, in a ubiquitous manner is hard to say. I'm just not sure. However, I see something, I guess I see the 1955 edict, right, that you asked originally in very different ways than simply architectural historians. I don't see it, not to layer negatives and positives looking back, but I don't necessarily see it as a negative. I can't, it's hard for me to simply extract architecture design from socioeconomics. I think they're, again, I know we keep coming back to this, they're inextricably linked. And so when you see the Khrushchev period, dealing with, the needs for excessive population growth with standardized housing, I think that's, the metro stations are a perfect reflection of that. And I see it in a way as a kind of really a true people's metro then, actually. Less rhetorical, less rhetorical, yet more real, so to speak. So everyday socialism, to borrow Fitzpatrick's term in a different way, I could come up with one real socialism, so to speak, in terms of transport housing, and one that's dealing with imminent issues and problems. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Olga, and I was a little girl in the Soviet Union in the 60s. And I did not live in Moscow, I lived in 100 kilometers from Moscow, in a small city. In the 60s, actually, what Khrushchev promised, he promised communism in 20 years, and he should somehow realize it. It was, I don't know what is specific, one specific time he said about that in 20 years we have communism in the Soviet Union. And then it started this campaign about building all these complexes and simplifications. And even I could remember they jailed people who feed their animals with bread, because there was also a hunger around the Moscow. Not in Moscow, but around the Moscow. Soviet Union could not revive this economic system for 15 years since war, so they tried to find any way to simplify, and all these excesses even don't feed animals with bread. So people really were jailed for that. And actually my grandfather got under this, and he also was in jail for some time, but it's a separate story. But my question is different. Is it possible for you, if someone asks you to summarize in several sentences, what kind of mythology and narrative built in when you go through Moscow metro or compared to for example, New York Metro or Paris Metro or London Metro, could you compare what's the difference between these narratives they create?
It's a great question. I mean, you know, again, this on some level, this is such a big project just internally, and you know, in Russia, in 1902, the president. But I've had this question asked before, you know, about, well, how do you think of it globally, right? And again, I apologize, I'm not an expert on global metros. However, what I would say is different cities at different times, international cities, build subways with different approaches, different amount of money, and so let's take some examples, right? The Washington D.C. Metro, which reminds me a little of the Moscow Metro because of its depth, right? And for those of you, right, who've ridden the D.C. Metro and the escalators, and it was called the Great Society Metro because it was built during the President Johnson's administration, if you're interested. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is, in terms of iconography, it's completely vacuous, right? I mean, it's a kind of sanitized, modernistic system. I mean, at least I'm just speaking for myself. When I'm in it, you know, I don't feel anything except the open space, so to speak. But it's very, very utilitarian, and you know, it works, and a lot of people use it. Well, at least until recently, when there's been a number of fires and problems, and it needs a lot of renovation. Okay, but there's other examples, right? The Mexico City Metro has iconography in it. The Budapest recently has been modernizing some of its metro stations. In Athens, Greece, right? And I'm Greek, like Yannis. My family, right, is in Athens. Some of my family's in Athens. That took a long time to build recently, right? Much like Stalin's metro, and that is a little more iconographic. So, I mean, if I'm just random sampling internationally, I think there's different levels of investment and different levels of meaning, right, globally in metros at different times. And some metros have changed globally, much like the Moscow Metro. If you talk to citizens, right, in various cities, and you know, for instance, if you think about the London Metro, in the 30s, there was a lot of modernist art in it, like sculptures, etc. Not necessarily bas-reliefs, but sculptures put into it, and this was very important to some of the London administrators who were interested in sort of beautifying, so to speak. So but that's a different process. That's a process of what I would call beautification, not glorification, if that makes sense. And there's I think a distinction there. Whereas, you know, probably in Stalin's time, and particularly late 40s, 50s, is a little more glorification. But I hope that answers your question. I mean, it's not just, if I may, just one other note, it's not just global cities and metros. I've started to do a little more research into metros and when they were formed in different parts of the Soviet Union. And my God, that's a whole project in and of itself. And you know, the journal Metro Stroy, construction of the metro, which was started in the 30s, and some of the originals are actually in the Slavonic Reading Room of the New York Public Library. It changed over time. And so originally it was just about Moscow, obviously, then Leningrad. But then, if you look at, I've looked at reams and runs of the ones in the 1970s and 80s, and there you have a lot of cover stories about metros in other parts of the Soviet Union. So talk about center periphery, not just only within Moscow, but within the Soyuz or the Union itself. This changed. There was more coverage about transport all over the Soviet Union. So it was almost like a norm being, excuse the pun, transported out radially from the center outward. I hope that answers your question. Is it Natalia?
Natasha.
Oh, Natasha, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you've considered the response, the literary response to these metro spaces in addition to archives and interviews. Because I think, at least for two examples I can think of, they kind of take the grandiosity and the beauty of the metro and they use it to expose cultural critique and see it as a place worthy of satire. So Palevin's novel Amun Ra, when he's an astronaut, thinks he's going to the moon, finds him in a subway station. And also there's a short story by Dovlatov, I can't remember the title, but he's like a failed artist turned construction worker, and he's installing a statue of Lomonosov in a station, and then it devolves into this critique of the mayor who takes off his boots during the opening ceremony. So what that might add to the narrative.
No, I think it's a great question. I have not, and I'm not sure if I'm going to. I mean, I haven't addressed it academically, and I'm not sure if I will, although I've looked at film from even the period of the early 60s and more contemporary novels. And there's also a lot of contemporary artists in Moscow today who stage a number of events, quote unquote, and they've contacted me, and I've been interested in talking with them as well. So I think it's Natasha, I forgot. I think it's not just a space for literary imagination, but a sort of contemporary artistic imagination too, as well. But again, I think for the moment, I'm sort of not sort of dealing with that as an academic, simply because it just would open up yet a whole nother tangent, though I find it fascinating, because if you think of also just personal memory, not just literary, but real memory, people, in the late Soviet period always would meet on station platforms, and it was a way to communicate before cell phones. So, I find that fascinating too, and what sorts of stories people had themselves about meeting friends and, memory from that perspective, not just the literary one. Although, maybe someday I'll delve into, film, more contemporary film art, not historical, and literature, but I think I'm going to leave it aside for the moment. But yeah, it's a great question. I've thought about it, and I've started looking at some of them. There's even been some science fiction, contemporary science fiction written about the metro too, as well. But anyways, thanks, Natasha.
Jamie Phillips. I have a question about how people behave in the metro, particularly initially. From a comparative dimension, it's sort of not only what kind of narratives they tell, but you just notice certain kind of behavioral norms they get established in different metros. And obviously, being in Mayakovskaya kind of instills a different feeling than being in West Fourth and sort of having to carry yourself. And given what you said about the peasant metropolis, and if it's opening in the 30s and you have all of this new influx of people, do you see in the archival documents a concern with how people are going to behave related to the one you're showing here, about the lighting and the fear? To what extent was it designed with this in mind? And in terms of people just not eating, that kind of thing, was this established early on and was it deliberate?
Well,
and the second question, if I might have just much
sure.
more factual. Do you know how many blast doors were installed?
I'm sorry, what?
The blast doors, these giant doors that I guess are, because they're bomb shelters in the Moscow metro.
Okay, well, Glenn, if I could answer your first question, and you might have to remind me a little bit about the details of your first question, but in terms of sort of norms of acting, is that what you were asking, or how people should behave? I don't know, I like to go back to this Kirovskaya photo from 1935, and when I looked at some memoir literature, one of the complaints of administrators was crowding outside. I don't know how I would describe it or translate it, but lingering. And you see this kind of, and it's not hooliganki, but people sort of loitering, so to speak. And sometimes bureaucrats thought that meant that, the early stations, go back then, there were limited stations in the first line, weren't enough to move the crowds. So it wasn't intentional. People were just, not moving literally. And then if you look at other parts of sort of memoir literature, particularly from bureaucrats and administrators, they were concerned with people learning how to literally go down escalators and keep in line. And I don't mean it like in terms of line and order, but I mean of movement, fear. And there were even descriptions of people not wanting to get on the escalator. It's sort of, I don't know, I'm thinking of a modern version of that. It reminds me of, like if you've ever seen Elf, then, the person trying to get on the escalator. But literally concerned with that, that is the tempo had to move quite a bit. There was another issue that I found interesting too, and this was corroborated, obviously not by a lot of people, but that there was loitering inside the stations. That is, people would go down in the 30s and then not leave. And and this was a problem as well. And so I read this particularly in the Moscow Party archive. So then I asked about, 5 years ago, one of my old friends' father was born in 1925. So he was in high school, right? And he fought in the Second World War, and then he was in high school in the late 30s. And what he told me is people weren't really always loitering, because I read him some of the archival letters, and he said sometimes people were just fascinated. Teenagers wanted to go down there. He even told me that when he was studying, I know this is just a singular anecdote, but right, when I interviewed him, he said that high school students in the 1930s, sometimes in the summer, right, at the end of the term when it was really hot in Moscow, and think of it recently, Moscow is a continental climate, it could get really hot. He said there were a few summers in the 30s where they just went down there to study. And he said his favorite was none other than Mayakovskaya. He said because of the marble and the sheen, it was very cool. And Dushkin really was very innovative with ventilation, and I think he was thinking a lot about that, not just vaulting, but having a lot. That was another thing to talk about the psychology. He felt if air was moving through it as best as it could, people would not, be breathing heavy, and they would be relaxed because the administrators wanted a tempo that moved and was calm, right, and that lack of loitering. But I do find it interesting that it wasn't like groups of gangs going down there necessarily, but it was people hanging out, and I think young people found it interesting, to go down there, and so the police tried to break that up occasionally, but it was very difficult. I hope that answers your first question in complexity. I'm sorry. Did someone?
We actually have come to an end, so I invite those with remaining questions to approach Professor Andrews.